there hasn't been a single weapon that I have tested out more in this DLC than the Euphoria. And that is for a couple of reasons. One, probably the most complicated weapon in the game. With how that buff works, it's just so complicated for no reason, and honestly there's still some things I don't understand about it, but I still do have a relatively decent grasp on how the whole buff works. And I am going to share all of my findings in today's video, but the second reason as to why I've been testing it out so much is because I'm getting so many requests about this thing, so many people are talking about this weapon, like every single day in my Twitch chat, my YouTube comment section, there's so many questions about this weapon. So I'm just going to make a whole dedicated video so we don't have to talk about it anymore, until hopefully when it gets buffed, because yes, it desperately does need a buff. And I will explain why later in the video. But as for the weapon itself, it is a twin blade, of which the twin blade category I also consider it to be very mid. It's not bad at all, it's still very viable, but the attacks always have like these longer animations that have these multi-hits, which is good for the multi-hit talismans. But with these multi-hit swings, the first one always ends up doing really bad damage, and most of the damage comes from the second swing, and also this two-handed light attack combo does less stance damage than a straight sword, and this is also true for the fully charged attack. These first few swings just do next to no damage, and all the good damage comes from the final swing, which for this long animation, there's a very good chance you get staggered out of it, and you're just going to be doing really bad damage. And yeah, this entire long attack does just as much stance damage as a charged heavy attack of a straight sword. Like, the only really good thing about the twin blades is going to be the power stance jumping heavy attack, which funnily enough is like the best attack in the entire game. But outside of that, they could be a lot better. But as for the Euphoria in particular, it is going to be a faith and holy based weapon. Actually is going to be one of the highest damaging twin blades in the game, but it is going to be comparable to a sacred infused black steel twin blade. At 70 faith, they get like a difference of 3 AR, but one thing to keep in mind is that the black steel twin blade can be infused, and if you throw sacred blade onto it, it can just end up doing more damage than the Euphoria. And that one also does get the cool poking attack Godskin Peeler moveset, so I might just prefer that one a bit more in general. But Euphoria is going to be a unique weapon with the unique skill called Euphoria Vortex, which is kind of like a similar version of a spinning weapon, just a short-range melee attack, and no, it does not work with the multi-hit talismans, and the total overall damage is like just as much as a charged heavy attack, but charged heavy attacks can just do way more damage as well, due to how many buffs that they actually do have. But the unique thing about this weapon is that you can gain these like damage stacks as like a buff by actually like hitting with the weapon itself, and after gaining these buffs, it actually transforms your skill into a cool projectile attack. There are just 2 different stacks. The first stack basically has the exact same animation as the regular skill, it just gives the weapon a projectile instead, and this projectile does do just as much damage as the skill if it was uncharged, but it's just going to do it at a distance, so it's not going to be like crazy amounts of damage. It does do 20 stance damage. It is going to be doing pure holy damage as well, and at point blank range, it is also going to be doing a little bit more damage because the weapon does have a hitbox, but don't expect too much more damage. But the best part about the weapon is when you're going to have it fully charged. When you do gain that second stack for that buff, the weapon will end up glowing a lot more than it used to. And then when you use the weapon skill, it kind of extends the duration of the whole projectile. And it does this like massive like Comma to Zero holy beam for like an additional 3 seconds. And this could do like 3 times as much damage as like the first projectile attack. And actually can do roughly 80 stance damage as well, which is very decent. And you're also not locked into a particular position. You actually can aim around and track with it, which is also very good. So this is actually a very powerful skill, and definitely worth the 28 FP. Now, unfortunately, you are stuck in a longer animation that you get no hyper armor in. So against enemies that attack really quickly, like especially the ones in the DLC, it's going to be very unlikely that you actually get this skill off. But even more unlikely than that is actually being able to get to the skill itself. It takes so much effort just to get to that second charge that is just ridiculous. Now, how this charge actually works and how to build up these stacks is based on the number of attacks, not damage. So roughly about 5 light attacks, whether it's one-handed or two-handed, will actually give you the buff. Or if you hit 2 fully charged heavy attacks, this will also proc the buff. And in terms of power stancing, it's literally worse. It takes like more than 10 light attacks just to actually proc the buff. If you're doing jumping attacks, it feels like it's more than 10. Now, if you are power stancing a second Euphoria, it is actually going to be a lot quicker, but it's still not going to be as quick as just like two-handing or just using charged heavy attacks. Now, the cool thing is about power stancing is that if you buff it with one weapon, you actually buff it with the other. You don't even need to have it equipped. You can just like switch to it later on. You can pull it straight out of your inventory and it will still work. But the unfortunate thing is that if you use the skill, it's actually going to remove it for both weapons. So the best way to actually proc this buff is just by just spamming charged heavy attacks as often as you can. Now, being that it is a longer animation, it's not going to be the easiest thing, but just know that this is just going to do it a lot faster. Now, the unfortunate thing about this is that it does have a decaying effect. You can't just like hit with 5 light attacks over the course of like 10 seconds because it's not going to work out that way. In fact, you can look at it like a timer. Every single time you hit with a weapon, it adds like a couple of seconds, and your objective is to try and get to 10 seconds. So you have to do like a lot of attacking just to get to that threshold. Now, once the first buff is actually activated, it will give you plus 35 to holy damage. Your weapon will actually glow a little bit. And as I mentioned, your skill will turn into a projectile attack. Now, this buff actually does last 15 seconds, but it can last a bit more depending on how you procced the buff to begin with. If you did it with a charged heavy attack, it could last about 20 seconds. If you did it with like the end of a light attack combo, it could also last about 20 seconds. If you just did it with like some random light attacks, even like a one-handed light attack, it could last about 15 seconds. I don't really know exactly what's going on there. It doesn't seem like it has to do with the fact that it's hitting multiple times with the same attack after it's been buffed, but just know that it can last a few extra seconds sometimes depending on which attack that you do. But it's still not going to matter that much because you can actually extend the duration of this timer with more attacks. Every single attack is just going to improve the duration by 2 seconds. And that is just for light attacks, whether it's one-handed or two-handed. And a charged heavy attack can improve the duration by about like 7 seconds or so. Now, obviously, when enemies end up having these crazy-ass combos, there's going to be plenty of times to go like 10 to 15 seconds without fighting or just getting off like one attack. And if that happens a couple of times, the buff is just going to wear off throughout the fight. It happens so many times. Now, the cool thing about this buff is that even when you remove the weapon completely, like completely just unequip it and put it back on again, you will still actually retain the buff. The timer is like tied to the character's body, not necessarily the weapon. And also upon using the skill, it actually is going to remove the buff as well, obviously. Now, to reach the second buff, you essentially have to get the weapon from like 15-second cooldown timer to like a 25-second cooldown timer, because at that threshold, then it kind of gets to the second buff. But obviously you proc the first buff, it either lasts 15 seconds or 20 seconds, and you kind of have to add like an additional 10 seconds on top of that, of which it's the exact same thing again. You can either use like 5 light attacks or 2 charged heavy attacks. But obviously the timer is counting down as you're trying to do it, so you're just like fighting against the time even more. But if you're aggressive enough and have hit the enemy with enough charged heavy attacks, you are going to proc the second buff, of which this second buff does give you plus 45 more holy damage. So in total, it is going to give you a plus 80 holy damaging buff. And also upon proccing the second buff, it is also just going to reset the timer back to 15 seconds. But also attacking is just going to improve the timer. Now, when this timer for the second buff does wear off, it does go back to the first one. It reverts back again. And then that timer starts off with about 5 seconds. So you have about 5 seconds left after the second buff goes away. Then you have your first buff again. Then after about 5 seconds, it'll also completely diminish. And being that you're starting off with 5 seconds, you're going to have to try and get back all the way up to like 25 seconds again. So you're doing even more work compared to what you had to do when you procced the buff the first time. It's probably a hard situation to grasp and try and explain. And it's a situation that you're rarely going to be in anyway. But just know that after your second buff does die out and you go back to the first buff again, it is going to be even harder to try and get back to that second buff. But just as I mentioned, once you do go to this second buff and you use the skill, it is going to remove the buff completely. But this skill, when it is charged up the second time, is just going to last like 3 times as long. And this is obviously just going to do about 3 times as much damage and do roughly 80 stance damage, which is really good. Now, despite the skill being really good, it's still nothing like groundbreaking or like amazing. There are other skills in this game that can consume just as much FP and do like just as much damage. And you can use those every single time. Now, the combination of like the damage, the range, and the stance damage is obviously going to make it really good. And I definitely do believe that it has to require you gaining stacks and having to do damage just to be able to get to that part. But I feel like it just takes so much effort. Every single fight that I've had, almost 90% of them actually, have resulted in me just straight out killing the boss before I even achieved a second buff. And in fact, when fighting the DLC bosses that have such long animations, I couldn't even achieve the first buff. It just couldn't even happen. Now you might think it's probably going to be better in like dungeons and things like that, but it's not even the case there because killing enemies also doesn't actually improve the buff or the duration of the buff or the stacks. And by the time that you actually walk from one room to the other, the buff is probably worn off. So it definitely feels like it's fine-tuned for a boss fight. But with how the bosses work in this game, it just doesn't really work out. Like, I know a lot of these bosses' movesets, so I'm like trying my best to like attack as much as I possibly can to try and gain the buffs. And even then, at this point, I'm better off just going all into a charged heavy attack build. And even if I do, I'm probably going to kill the boss even before the first buff. They definitely need to make it to where it just does not decay. Like, as soon as you hit the buff, have a timer, that's perfectly fine. But they shouldn't also have the timer affect how long it takes for me to actually gain the first and second buff. The timer should just be for how long the buff lasts. Like, I should be able to hit like an enemy like 3 or 4 times, then wait like 5 to 10 seconds, hit an enemy again a couple more times, then I gain the buff, then my 15-second timer starts, and then we can go from there. Then every single time that I hit, it just increases my stacks, but it also increases the time. Like, that would just work so much better. Because the way that it stands right now, it is just not that viable for a boss fight. You're better off just going into like a twin blade jumping attack build or a charged heavy attack build with many other different types of weapons, and it does perform so much better because the amount of effort and time that you actually spent just trying to get off charged heavy attacks. To get the buff, you could have used so many other different types of weapons or skills to actually do the exact same job, but just a lot faster. Anyway, that is the video now done and complete. Sorry if that was a bit too complicated and the information wasn't as clear. The only thing that you do need to know is that it's mid and it needs to get buffed. Hopefully it happens in the next patch. But yes, please, no more Euphoria questions. Hopefully put that conversation to rest. And yeah, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys around. Bye.